Everyone, thanks so much for joining us. We're just going to pause for a few seconds as people join the Zoom line, take their virtual seat. See the numbers ticking up here. Okay, great. Well, I'm going to get started. Hi, everyone. Thank you so much for joining us for the special event tonight. My name is Alex Rosenberg, and I'm the Member and Events Manager at National Review Institute, based out of New York City. We're so pleased to host this discussion tonight with our friends at the Thomas Jefferson Institute. Before we get started, I just want to say a few words about NRI and our partnership with our friends here. So many of you, hopefully most of you, are familiar with National Review Magazine and nationalreview.com, but you may not know about the Institute. So NRI was founded by Bill Buckley to support the top talent at the magazine and also to complement the mission of the magazine and take the conservative message and writing and ideas out all across the country. So one of the ways that we do that at NRI is through our regional partnership event series, which allows us to partner with groups like the Thomas Jefferson Institute and others, and to help grow the conservative movement and support our allied partners. So thanks, Chris, to you and your team at Thomas Jefferson Institute and for all the great public policy work you guys are doing in Virginia. So while we're not quite traveling all around the country yet, spreading our conservative message, we are busy hosting many forums just like this one virtually over Zoom for our friends and supporters during this quarantine time. And we're hosting events like this discussing the pressing issues of the day, but also hoping to offer our friends and supporters a reprieve from the news cycle. And so to that end, we have a virtual book club. We've featured Jay Norlinger and Rick Brookhiser and are about to do one with Douglas Murray in the new year. And also a virtual movie club with Kevin Williamson and Kyle Smith, which is really entertaining. So if you're interested in learning more about our work at the Institute and our 1955 Society, which is our community of supporters, I encourage you to reach out to me or visit our website, nrinstitute.org. Again, thanks so much for joining us. You guys are in for a real treat tonight with Kevin Hassett. He's one of our biggest stars at National Review Institute, and I know he has a lot to talk about tonight. Now I'm going to turn it over to Chris, Thomas Jefferson Institute, to say a few words about his organization and introduce tonight's event. Thanks so much.
Good evening. Welcome. My name is Chris Braunlick. I'm president of the Thomas Jefferson Institute for Public Policy. Thanks for joining us. For those of you who are new to one of our events, the Jefferson Institute is a state-based think tank, sort of a Virginia version of the Heritage Foundation that crafts and promotes public policy solutions to advance prosperity and opportunity for all Virginians and ensure that people are empowered to make decisions for themselves. In November of 2019, the road to that goal in Virginia got a lot steeper, and last Tuesday it got harder still. That's why we're especially glad to have you with us and why we hope to work with you in the months ahead. Part of accomplishing that is offering an opportunity for conservatives to learn about the issues of the day, and one mechanism is our Federal Policy Dinner Series sponsored by the Reince Pierce Family Foundation. This is the third year we've had the privilege of partnering with National Review Institute, and we're especially grateful to the team at NRI for their support and their collaboration. The Thomas Jefferson Institute has a fantastic board of directors, and I've asked one of our board members to introduce our speaker. Steve Cassidy has been named by Barron's as Virginia's #1 financial advisor for each of the last 5 years. He's a regular reader of Kevin Hassett. Needless to say, he has not only a policy interest, but a professional interest in the post-election economy. So Steve, over to you.
Thanks, Chris, and thanks for all the excellent work you're doing at TGI. We really appreciate it. So we're very honored tonight to have Kevin Hassett, who's a senior advisor to the National Review Capital Matters. He's also a distinguished visiting fellow at the Hoover Institution and vice president of the Lindsay Group. Kevin has served as chairman of the President's Council of Economic Advisors beginning in 2017 and rejoined the White House this spring as senior advisor to the president. Prior to his White House service, Hassett was the research director at the American Enterprise Institute for many years. He He also was a senior economist at the Board of Governors of the Federal Reserve System and as an associate professor of economics and finance at Columbia University's Graduate School of Business, as well as a visiting professor at New York University's Law School. He was an advisor to the U.S. Treasury Department during the administrations of George H.W. Bush and Bill Clinton. He also served as an advisor to the campaigns of George W. Bush, John McCain, and Mitt Romney, has contributed regular columns to the National Review for almost 2 decades, and has written columns published in the Washington Post, the New York Times, the Wall Street Journal, and Bloomberg. Talk about diversity. An October Wall Street Journal editorial referenced Kevin Hassett in discussing the cost of Bidenomics. I'm certain that's something we'll all look forward to hearing about tonight, and we're pleased to have Kevin with us this evening. Kevin?
Yeah. Hey, thanks for the excessively kind introduction, Steve, and thank you to the National Review Institute, Amanda for organizing this, and Chris for co-sponsoring it with us. I know the work that the Thomas Jefferson Institute does is so important. And thank all of you for joining us on this Zoom call. The main objective for us of the Zoom call really is to have a conversation, not to have me just sort of spewing economics at you. That's hard enough, at 8 in the morning. It's really hard at 7 in the evening. But I want to start by sort of talking about what we did at National Review Capital Matters as the election approached, which is that the mission really of Capital Matters is to be a place where capitalist ideas and policy ideas can be explored and do so in a sort of safe environment. Rich Lowry likes to say that we're never going to be canceled, and that means that we can be a place that stands up for free markets and capitalism, no matter what happens to the rest of the media industrial complex. And as the election approached, it became clear to Andrew Studiford and I that there really wasn't much focus on the actual policy substance. That there was a heck of a lot of focus on a lot of issues that may have been very important, but Vice President Biden, to his credit, had a really large and talented policy team that put together this very, very detailed proposal with, in many, many different areas about what he would do in economic policy space if elected. And pretty much nobody was talking about it. And so what we did is we launched a series that dug, sort of deeply into the Biden proposal. I think that if the Democrats had the sweep that all the pollsters told you they were going to have, then those policy proposals would be like really crucial right now, that we'd all be poring over them even more, because we'd be sure that they're going to be legislated next year. Right now, the Senate hangs in the balance, and so whether or not you're going to have to immerse yourself in those detailed proposals or not, I think will depend a little bit on what happens in runoff elections in Georgia. But I think that the headline is just that Joe Biden's plan is to number one, have a very large tax increase, and the tax increase is basically a reversal of the tax cuts that President Trump pushed, but also he takes away the cap on the Social Security tax. And so if you add it all up, that he gets the top marginal tax rate on small businesses and pass-through entities, way up into the 50s, even before you look at state and local taxes. In the Affordable Care Act, he expands the Affordable Care Act some, which we talk about as we explore that segment of his proposal, which ends up increasing marginal tax rates on labor quite a bit. And we expect that he's going to pursue much more aggressive regulation. The regulation part is actually something that I think, regardless of what happens to the Senate, he'll be able to do. And then finally, he had a very, very big climate agenda that, to put in perspective, we found that basically he's moving everybody into electric cars. And electric cars, Teslas are really nice cars, but they're kind of about $12,000 a car more expensive than a comparable car. And if you move all the passenger miles from internal combustion engines to electric vehicles, then you need to increase power generation in the US by 25%, which is a pretty big number. But at the same time, they're promising to end the consumption of fossil fuels, and fossil fuels account for about 70% of power generation in the US right now. And so, we found that the Biden proposal would have sort of had to reboot 95% of the power grid right now. And of course, that's pretty costly. So we added up all the costs of that. And whether or not it happens, of course, is going to depend now on the political future, which is a lot more uncertain than I think the pollsters led us to believe it would be before the election. I think that if Vice President Biden does prevail after all of the disputes that are going on right now, that the very next thing on the docket economically is going to be whether we have another stimulus in the lame duck session, and then again whether we have a stimulus next year. My expectation is that we might have two more, that we'll have one in the lame duck session and we'll have one again next year. And the reasons are, one, I think that the macroeconomic disruption from COVID is not over. And indeed, it might likely get quite a bit worse before it gets better. Because if there really is going to be, and we now expect there will be, a vaccine, say, that's widely available early next year, then the benefit to sort of really shutting down hard in December gets quite a bit higher. And so I think with that in mind, and also the fact that a lot of the things that were passed in the previous stimulus bill, like the special facilities at the Federal Reserve expire in December, means that they're pretty much going to have a stimulus bill this year. My guess is that if Vice President Biden takes the White House and the Republicans control the Senate, that a stimulus or infrastructure bill would be the top of the list next year, but that the rest of the agenda that we so carefully laid out at Capitol Matters would be something that Vice President Biden would have to pursue perhaps after a midterm election that breaks his way. And so that's my really, really quick overview. And again, I know we don't have a huge amount of time, and I'm very interested to both talk with Chris a little bit about what questions he has and also to hear from you. And with that, I'll just hand it back to Chris and let him moderate now the discussion.
Okay. Hi, thank you, Kevin. Appreciate it very much. Just a couple of things. One, if you do have questions, put them in the chat box, which should be at the bottom of the center of your screen, and we'll get to as many as we can in the time we have. Second, I did notice that one of those, I referenced the uphill battle this year. I did notice that one of those that had registered was Congressman-elect Bob Good, and I don't know if he's on, but if he is on, congratulations, Congressman, and welcome. Glad to have you with us. And in addition, Amanda has put into the chat box links to the studies that Kevin referenced, and I urge you to go there and copy it and take a look at those studies. They're good. First question from Virginia: what do you anticipate will occur during the next 6 months, and thus how should we prepare?
Well, I think that as an economist, I'm not very, I think that if you go to National Review today, there's a heck of a lot of wisdom about what's going on in the election. I think that, probably the betting markets right now, I haven't looked at the odds, but they're probably the best summary of the way economists think about things, because they're actually letting markets work, is that Vice President Biden is able to hold on despite the sort of ballot disputes, but the Republicans hold on to the Senate because the runoffs down in Georgia tend to sort of break their way. I think that if that happens, then in some sense, Mitch McConnell might become the best friend that Vice President Biden ever had, because I think that one of the problems that we saw this in the presidential debates too, that Vice President Biden had, is that he had to basically embrace these policies, like the thing I talked about that sort of more or less rebooted 95% of the power grid, right? And destroyed $5 trillion in wealth of fossil fuels, that he had to embrace those things in order to get, the left of his party to be enthusiastic about him. But he kind of was backing away from them in the debates a little bit, where he said he's not really for the Green New Deal, even though he says it's a great framework on his website and so on. And so I think that if there was the Democratic sweep that the pollsters told us was going to happen, that Vice President Biden, to the extent that he's more moderate than AOC say, was going to have a real problem where the people on the left in the Senate and the House, maybe to the left of him, would pass bills that he probably wouldn't be able to veto. And then you would have seen just like an explosion of policy next year, which I guess could conceivably happen if Democrats capture the Senate. But it might not as well, because there are like Joe Manchin and moderates in the Senate that might not want to like destroy the filibuster forever and so on like that. And so my guess is that if it's a divided government, then what's going to happen is that they're going to focus on stimulus, and usually infrastructure is something that divided governments can deal with because everybody wants to build a highway or improve the potholes or so on. And that the policy agenda will be kind of targeted towards the recovery from COVID, but not anywhere close to the super, super ambitious thing that was outlined on Vice President Biden's website.
And you know, that's exactly what happened in Virginia. The Democratic left took everything in the House and Senate, and the governor, who was perceived as a moderate, got pushed over to the left considerably. This question is from an old friend of the Jefferson Institute, former delegate here in Virginia, John O'Bannon. Can you quantify how much influence the progressive left wing will be able to influence the economic picture and where it will show up? That's sort of linked to the last question, but.
Yeah, that's right. And you know, I think that the place where you really are going to have to pay attention is in the sort of executive order and regulatory space. You know, I think that, you know, for the purposes of our conversation, we can sort of stipulate henceforth that we're just going to assume that Vice President Biden prevails and that the Senate is held by Republicans, just so we don't have to keep doing contingent arguments, right? So I think that in that case, then what's going to happen is that, you know, financial regulators are going to get much more aggressive. You know, Elizabeth Warren probably is going to have a lot of say over who gets to run the financial regulatory bodies. The EPA is going to, you know, get very aggressive again about climate regulation and CO2 emission regulation. Regulatory costs are going to go up a lot. There'll probably be a heck of a lot of new regulations. And one of the things that we noticed in the Trump administration in the very first year is that President Trump basically froze new regulations almost completely. And that had a huge positive effect on small businesses, because new regulations are actually really costly to figure out. And so if you're some guy who's making, you know, I don't know, apple juice in some town in Virginia, and then they change like the water regs, then you got to hire engineers and lawyers and stuff to tell you whether it affects you and how to change what you're doing. And that can be really quite costly. And the point is that the regulation that's 10 years old, you already figured out. But the new regulation can be, you know, quite a stressful thing for a person who's operating a business. And so what we found was that when we stopped creating new regulations, it created this massive positive explosion in sentiment for small businesses, especially because they no longer had to spend millions and millions of hours complying with new regulations. And so in terms of what to expect, you know, under our sort of null hypothesis, you know, that there's Republicans in the Senate and Vice President Biden in the White House, then it's really the regulatory state that's most likely to get super aggressive.
That actually did happen in Virginia with an apple juice maker that was practically driven out of business until Governor George Allen stepped in. The next question is from Kenneth. So nice to hear your wisdom again. I'm concerned about what Biden will mean for wealth evaporation and tax inversions. I worked for the Treasury during the Obama years, and I don't feel that we, the U.S., hears enough about the money that left the country to avoid the craziness. I see the environment to be ripe for massive flight. What are your thoughts?
You know, I think that would be something that I would agree with if the Biden tax plan were to become law. And it's not that everything about it is stupid and wrong, but the corporate side basically would, you know, raise the rate back up to, I think it was 28%, and maybe it was 25. And the point is just that that rate right now in the U.S. is just equal to the average of our trading partners. And so that if we go back up, then there's going to be a really strong incentive to move overseas, or even to just move your headquarters overseas and invert. And so that definitely would have happened, but I don't think that in our base case it's very likely that those tax increases are going to come. Now, it is true that there's some stuff that expires, like, so for example, the expensing of capital purchases. That expensing is going to have to be renewed in some legislation sometime. But most of the stuff is there for a while and not likely to be reversed. In terms of wealth creation, one of the things that I've always been interested in is that there was this mutual fund a long time ago that called itself the Congressional Effect Fund, and it was based on the idea that if you go back and look at U.S. history, then almost all of the gains in the stock market happened when everybody in Washington was out of town. And so the congressional effect was you invest in equities when the politicians are out of town, but you put your money in cash when they're in town. And it turned out that strategy more or less would have captured with much less risk all the gains in the stock market going back to like the 1800s or something like that. And so the corollary of that, though, is that the gridlock tends to be something that markets really like. And so I think that if there's gridlock, if the sort of super aggressive Biden agenda has a very low chance of becoming law, and basically Congress focuses on things that are stimulative while the Fed continues to do so as well, then that's a very positive recipe for equities and wealth creation generally. The thing that I'm most worried about is in that space is basically two things. Again, one is that we hopefully now know that there's an approach to a COVID vaccine that can be effective, and we can all hopefully get back to our normal lives sometime soon. But I think that a lot of people haven't thought through the dynamics of the economics of that so that I think conservatives have been pretty aggressive. You see it in red states where red states have opened up their economy. Their insured unemployment as a share of their total workforce is down to about 4%. Whereas in blue states that's run by blue governors, it's up above 8%. And so if you look at the sort of political dispute, it's been kind of maybe the blue guys have been more willing to shut down and be super risk averse about COVID, whereas the red places are thinking, oh, well, we should open up because the costs are so high, we might not have an economy left if we don't. The issue is just that if you knew for sure that on January 1st, there's going to be a vaccine for everybody, then it changes that calculus quite a bit, right? Like, so it really is the case that if you thought for sure you're going to have a vaccine and you're not going to have to deal with this, terrible plague, if you just sort of hide until January, then the incentive to really, really ramp back in the short term is quite high. And so the first thing that I'm a little concerned about in terms of like the need for stimulus is that, people really might hunker down, and even more so given that there might be a vaccine coming. But the second thing is that there's a heck of a lot of real estate distress in the country right now. And you can imagine that if you like own a strip mall where half the tenants were restaurants, you've now been collecting a lot of rent this year. And if you look at the history of financial crises, a lot of times what happens is you get a shock kind of like that. And then all of a sudden, a lot of commercial and residential real estate folks start, handing the keys to banks. And then, prices start to go down and the banks start to get in trouble. And that very often happens sort of like 8 to 10 months after the initial shock. If you go back and look at the financial crisis, housing prices kind of collapsed first. And then everything unraveled like really just about like a year later. And so this other thing that's a major concern for me going into next year is that, if we do go into lockdown mode a little bit more because of the rational sort of desire to wait until there's a vaccine, then there might be a heck of a lot of, distressed businesses that decide that they just don't have the cash to keep going. And if that happens, it could lead to a financial problem that's much more significant than anything we've seen this year.
Well, and on the subject of COVID and stimulus, Maury asks the deficit, talks about the deficit, which has ballooned astronomically. Stimulus today, how long can that dangerous situation be sustained? And more importantly, how do we fix it?
Yeah, so the deficit has skyrocketed, and it's at a kind of level that presents policymakers with a really hard choice. And the choice is that if you cut spending a lot in order to reduce the deficit, then that spending reduction would be like a negative stimulus to GDP. Keynesians might put a bigger multiple than I would on and what that negative stimulus does, but the multiple is not zero, right? Like so if you really reduce spending a heck of a lot, then in the short term that could be a recessionary force. The alternative would be to try to find ways to get more revenue, but there aren't a lot of ways to get more revenue that aren't contractionary as well. And so Congress is really going to be at a tough spot because we've sort of jacked up everything in order to help us ride through this pandemic. And if you sort of allow it to return to trend, then that's going to be a negative force for the economy. At the same time, the deficit's so high that people are going to have to worry about, well, how are we going to deal with it in the long run? And the history of how governments deal with debt shocks like what we've seen so far, this is a history that's got hundreds and hundreds of years, is that you tend to see inflation, right? Because a huge share of our debt is not inflation protected, it's nominal. So if inflation were to suddenly go way above the Fed's target, then that would be like a capital gain for the US government on the debt that it owes, because it's paying back with money that's not worth as much. And so I think that I'm very concerned that inflation could be a big major risk over the next couple of years, especially if the vaccine comes out soon and then we get like the sigh of relief rally in the economy that everybody expects will happen once we're all vaccinated. You could easily see GDP growth going up so high that inflation spikes in a way that we haven't seen in decades.
Well, on the subject of deficits, another deficit, Tony asks if there are any hints or you have any sense of what Biden would do on trade.
On trade? Did you say trade? Yeah, I'm sorry. Your mic is going in a little out. Yeah, so the trade question is a wide open one for me because the president's tariffs, were very popular with the unions that tend to be big supporters of Democrats, and the free trade coalition in Congress tends to be mostly Republicans with, some moderate Democrats, and, Bill Clinton and Barack Obama were, pursued free trade policies pretty aggressively, but with like sort of tariffs in place and so on, and the unions probably pretty happy that they're there. I think that Biden might have a big problem undoing the things that President Trump has done. And he might not really be super willing to be easy on China, given how unpopular China is, both because of the intellectual property theft and so on, and because of the way they apparently covered up the virus in the beginning. And so I think that trade policy is something that will be a lot less, there'll be a lot less brinksmanship, but I think that the stuff, the ground that's been covered by the president might not be reversed.
Sabina asks about Medicare for all. Is Biden going to re-implement Obamacare, go forward? What kind of changes do you think is likely to happen in healthcare? How will insurance companies like United Healthcare influence any of those changes in policy?
Yeah, so it's a great question, and we have a whole lengthy article at the National Review website on this topic specifically. But I think that the basic question is, and again, this is now assuming that the Biden proposal on his campaign website, let's just assume that were to become law, then what you're basically looking at is a public insurance option. And if the public insurance option is attractive, because like taxpayers are basically subsidizing your insurance, then you could expect that the public option would gradually put all the private insurance companies out of business, because they won't really be able to compete, because the government doesn't have to make a profit in order to keep the insurance going, because the government, like, we were just talking about the deficit, right? The government is running deficits all the time, and so why not do that for health insurance too? On the other hand, the public option might really stink. It could be that nobody likes it, and so therefore it doesn't have much of an effect. But I think that the intent of advocates of the public option.
And she's back. So I can, Chris, I remembered yours. This one is from Chris, who is an economist and is also a columnist for the Richmond Times-Dispatch. And the question had to do with the fact that Virginia is very dependent on defense spending. What do you think will happen with defense spending in a Biden administration?
Yeah, you're sure right about that, about Virginia's dependence on defense spending, both in Northern Virginia and in Southern Virginia. That again, along our base path where there's a divided government, then the issue will just be, do they at some point decide to pursue deficit reduction with a sort of earnest long-run plan? If they do, then that would probably slow defense spending along with everything else. But my guess is that's not something that would be on the agenda in the first year, because we'll still be recovering from the pandemic. And I think people are worried enough about the transition from closed to open that it's pretty unlikely that a big sort of deficit reduction package would make it to the fore. But it is the case that in the long run, the deficit's so large, somebody's going to have to do something about it. And when that occurs, pretty much in U.S. spending history, there's only one time where defense spending, basically went up while everything else went down, and that was the first couple of years of the Reagan administration. Other than that, things have tended to be tethered to one another.
Well, I can do it now. I just wanted to say to everybody, if you have questions, we're slowly getting a couple of folks back. Apologize for what happened. It's far better than the last Zoom call I hosted, where I spoke for 60 seconds before somebody finally held up a sign that said unmute yourself. But if you do have questions, please put them in the chat room, and I know Kevin will be happy and love to answer them. I did see a quote from you, and it took place when you arrived in Ireland. It had to do with international trade, but international politics. But you indicated, you referenced the U.S. tax code as being something that had been written by someone on acid. What if you could wave a magic wand and fix the U.S. tax code? What would you do?
Well, I think that we made a lot of progress on that, and the story about where we were before TICJA, it's really important to remind people about it, that basically we were the highest corporate tax place on earth, but you could avoid the corporate tax if you logged your profits overseas and then didn't mail the money home. And so if I, as an example, let's just say that Chris and Kevin had a soap company that had been operating in the US forever and been quite profitable. If we moved our factory to Ireland, then we could, suppose we sell the soap for $10 a bar, then we could buy it from the Irish subsidiary for $11 a bar and sell it in the US for $10 a bar, and then post a loss in the US and a huge profit in Ireland. And the loss in the US we could carry back against our past taxes. And so effectively tax refunds would pay for us to move our factory to Ireland. And that was the thing that I was talking about when that quote that you mentioned was used, because basically we had a system that fundamentally didn't make any sense at all and encouraged people to move jobs overseas. And, we pretty much fixed that, but the, target will be moving, so that there are a lot of countries around the world that will want to reduce their tax rates even more over time. There is a tax competition going on, and we got ourselves back in the game. But if we just sort of stay here, my guess is 10 years from now, then it'll once again look like we've done something very, very foolish.
Again, if you do do have questions, we are gaining a couple of folks coming back in. Please put them into the chat room. We do have a question.
Yeah, I see it. The Morris Nunez question.
Okay.
Yeah, so Morris raises a really important point, and it's something that's not very well understood by a lot of folks. And it's basically this, that so if a person goes bankrupt, then probably the path that happens is that they spend too much money on stuff. Maybe they lose their job, and so they have a lot of debts, but they don't have much income. And then the creditors start hassling them, and then eventually it reaches the point where they just give up and they go to a bankruptcy court and they try to restructure, and everybody takes 50 cents on the dollar or something like that. So that's the way an individual goes bankrupt. But for a country, what happens is that we borrowed $100 billion from the Chinese last year for a year, a one-year instrument. And now here is a year later, we got to give them the money back. And so we go out and we have to borrow the money from somebody else. And so if, on next Monday, we go out in order to borrow money from other people in order to roll over our debt, then that could fail because everybody decides they don't want to lend to us anymore because they don't think that we look like a good bet. And if that happened, then pretty much overnight, the US could default because nobody's willing to lend us money, and it could happen next week. I would guess that if that happened, that the Fed would just sort of step in and start buying things. That would set off inflationary fears. But there is a risk, that basically government debt problems don't come gradually like the individual bankruptcy, the example that I gave. They tend to happen quick because of failed auctions.
Alan asked a question I've heard before. It has to do with the Green New Deal, and if he takes his gas card to the gas station, loads up fuel, takes 10 minutes, he can travel 300 miles. Electric will take 1 to 2 hours for individuals. And does the Green New Deal, has anybody ever analyzed the amount of extra time, downtime it's going to take?
I'm not aware of people having done that, and I know that in our analysis of the Green New Deal, in the Hoover study that we wrote a lot about at National Review and Capital Matters, we didn't account for that factor. And I think that you could sort of say that the assumption is that people are plugging it in while they're sleeping, for the most part. But yeah, it's a totally fair point. And if you're taking a long trip, then it is something that still you really have to worry about, right? So you have to figure out like where you're going to stop while you reload the battery.
I guess this has to do with the stimulus that we're talking about passing soon, but any ballpark figure on what you think will eventually get passed, the new circumstances? And I guess will it get passed before January 1st?
Yeah, I expect they'll have to do some lame duck stuff, after they're done fighting over the election. And one of the reasons is that like the emergency facilities that they gave the Fed because of COVID expire. And so that if they don't at least pass a bill to extend them, then, it could be that people start to worry that one of the insurance policies that we built with the stimulus bill last spring will be taken away. And so I would guess that they'll do sort of some kind of small stimulus, a stopgap measure that gets you through to March in December. And then there'll be a bigger thing in March. Exactly how big it is going to depend a lot on the circumstances on the ground. If the economy is recovering, it's been surprising on the upside enormously. If it continues to do so, and 5 other vaccines are approved so that we can get everybody vaccinated by January 1, then it could be that the need for stimulus is not so apparent, and then they just sort of move on to an infrastructure bill or something to give them something to do.
We're coming up on the end. Let me just give one more question, and that has to do with apprenticeships. Do you think there'll be support in the Biden administration apprenticeships as they were under Trump, as well as credentials versus college degrees?
That it's probably the case that a lot of those efforts of President Trump will be dropped, and that traditionally Democrats have believed that the sort of path to labor market success for people is the Department of Labor's training programs and so on. And, I found little evidence that those things work, but they're, big bureaucratic slush funds for unions and so on. And so my guess is that a lot of the progress we've made on apprenticeships and training and stuff will be reversed under Vice President Biden should he take the White House.
Well, thank you very much. Any concluding observations you'd like to make?
No, I'd just like to thank everybody for joining us tonight. Sorry about the technical glitch, but at the National Review Institute, and I'm sure the TJ Institute, that we're going to continue this conversation for a good long time. And we thank you for your participation and your support.
And I'll echo that. Thank everyone, especially the ones who signed twice and came back when we got knocked off. It happens sometimes. We apologize, and enjoy your dessert. Thank you.